So I'm hoping that everyone is going to find this an interesting session. I find when I'm talking to different groups, especially in Australia, a lot of people have heard about biosecurity, understand it, and rate it of really high importance. But sometimes, the learning about biosecurity, they haven't heard a lot about it. They haven't heard a lot of case studies or a lot of detail, and they haven't certainly heard a lot of detail about biosecurity activities going on in different production industries. So I'm hoping that you find this interesting and that during this presentation, you get a better sense for why the citrus industry is running its biosecurity program, particularly in relation to these bud stick collections, and why it's important for us and why we're really thankful that we have volunteers involved in sending us these samples as well. So if there are any questions, if you could either hold your question to the end of the presentation or pop your question in the chat and I can go through them at the end of the presentation. But I do have a couple of slides that will be a little bit more interactive as well, just for a bit of fun too. So my name is Jessica Lai. I work on the Citrus Watch program, which is a national biosecurity program funded through the citrus industry, research and development levies, and plant health levy. I work for Citrus Australia. I've been with Citrus Australia for a couple of years, and before working for Citrus Australia, I was working in the grains industry, and before that I was working in biosecurity for the vegetable industry. So I've been working in horticulture and more broadly agriculture for a little while now, and it's an interesting and dynamic field to work in, and I love it. So just diving right in, I thought I'd just give you a real quick overview of the industry that I work for, which is the Australian commercial citrus industry. So a lot of us grow citrus at home, and I grow citrus at home. I love growing my citrus trees. What maybe a lot of people don't realise is how large our commercial citrus industry is in Australia and how vibrant and dynamic it is. So I just want to paint a bit of a picture for you today. Just admit a couple more guests. Okay, so in Australia, we have a few what we call major production regions, citrus production regions, and the major production region is located in the Riverina, which is around the Griffith, Wagga Wagga area, in southern New South Wales. And we also have a very major growing region in the Sunraysia, what's called the Murray Valley in this map here. So I think when people think of citrus, they often think of Sunraysia. It's got that, that branding connection with growing citrus in the sun up there. We have citrus grown in the Riverland of South Australia as well, on the Murray. Some citrus in Western Australia, mostly north of Perth, and in southern Queensland in the Gayndah-Mundubbera area. And we have some minor production regions that are growing over time. So in particular, one production region that's well known for its lime production now is far north Queensland, around the Mareeba area, that Dimbula area, and people are starting to grow mandarin up there now as well, and learning how to grow a good mandarin. So that's a growing region. So we're a growing industry. We grow across about 30,000 commercial hectares across Australia. And in the last 10 years, we've seen a really high increase in the number of exported citrus exported out of Australia to countries like China, Thailand, Japan, Korea, and growth in exports has been about 30% in the last 10 years. So that's really high. We've also had a commensurate growth in plantings of commercial citrus trees of about 30% in the last 10 years, and we're producing around 800 to 900,000 tonne per annum. And the way that the industry is sectioned up is about a quarter of the citrus grown in the country goes to juicing. A third goes to the domestic market as fresh produce, and about a third goes to export. So there's a lot of, within these citrus growing regions, there are obviously communities surrounding these regions that aren't directly involved in the production of citrus, but they benefit from these citrus industries. So even cafes and services in the surrounding towns, all of the supply chain, the logistics companies, the packers, the transport services that take the fruit to the ports. So all of these surrounding businesses really benefit from these industries. So across the board, we have about 1,500 citrus businesses directly involved in production. But if you expand that out to those sort of service providers outside of the direct production, the benefits in terms of local economies is much greater. And before I move on to a bit of biosecurity discussion, just lastly, if you're interested to know what is grown most in the Australian citrus industry, we grow mostly oranges. About 62% of the national hectare production is oranges, a mixture of Navels and Valencia for juicy. About 28% are mandarins or tangelos, and then a smaller amount of lemon and lime is grown for commercial purposes, and grapefruit and pomelo. And we're a very big exporter, as I mentioned. So I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, the biosecurity context that our industry is functioning in. It's becoming more and more important over time for citrus growers to think about biosecurity. I'll talk a little bit about the risks in a couple of slides and how those risks are growing. But in terms of day-to-day business as usual, anyone who grows produce, and if you grow crops at home, you'll know it can be difficult to grow a nice piece of fruit that when you're dealing with pests and diseases that we already have in the country now. So we have pests and diseases span a whole range of insect groups, for instance, such as flies. One of the most common pests that we're starting to deal with more and more commonly in Melbourne, and certainly dealing with it in Queensland and Sydney and other places, is Queensland fruit fly. In some regions of Australia, such as around Perth, they also have medfly. We have thrips, we have aphids, we have different kinds of caterpillars that can impact on different crops that we might grow. Like armyworm is a really common kind of caterpillar that can eat our corn and other kinds of crops. Mites can be really difficult to control. So two-spotted mite is renowned for being difficult to control with any sort of insecticide because it's highly resistant to many different kinds of actives. And then we have a whole range of diseases. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what the type of pest species is that I've put up here on the slide, this picture? Just the common name. You can put it in the chat or you can call it out. I don't mind.
Aphid of some sort?
Yep, you got it. It's an aphid. That's correct. So this one is brown citrus aphid. We have a couple of different types in Australia, but you'll see that, and particularly in the warmer, milder weather in spring and autumn on your citrus plants. So producing a nice piece of fruit can be challenging because particularly markets asking for our commercially grown fruit can be really stringent in terms of the level of quality that they want to see. So for instance, they don't want to see bites, chew marks, any sort of chlorosis, necrotic tissue. We have to make sure there's no frass from insects, that the produce is totally clean. If a veggie grower is growing a lettuce, for instance, they need to make sure it's free of insects, even between the leaves. They don't want any discoloration or cracking or marks from disease. So it can be a really difficult job to make sure that our produce is grown in such a way that it's not too impacted by insects and diseases in the environment. You'll never get rid of them all, but suppression is the goal. So when a producer is growing their fruit, apart from running the farm and harvesting schedules and making sure they have labour for picking and all of those other considerations, they have to consider what's going on in their paddocks and what's eating their fruit. So they have to consider costs of control. They have to consider, sometimes when we have pests in a local environment, they can impact on local ecology as well, which can then impact on the number of pests we have in an orchard. So for instance, impacts on beneficial insects by, invasive ants, for instance. They have to think about, if they're going to apply any insecticides, they also have to consider potential for resistance as well. We don't want to overuse insecticides. That can be a real problem. And any pests, particularly new pests to a region, can disrupt integrated pest management plans that are currently employed. So when farmers are using cultural controls, pruning practices, for instance, or releasing beneficial insects to make sure they can grow a nice piece of fruit, if they get a new pest in a region, then they have to potentially use an insecticide, which is going to throw out the entire integrated pest management plan. And that's what happens in terms of biosecurity. When we get a new species into the country, we need to learn how to manage it if we can't eradicate it, which can throw up all sorts of problems at a local level when we're producing fruit. So just some figures from the Food and Agriculture Organization that they came out with a couple of years ago that I found were really interesting. So they estimated that globally, there is a 20 to 40% loss in crop production each year to pests, and the annual cost globally of plant diseases to the global economy is 220 billion, which is huge, and the annual cost of plant insect pests to the global economy is 70 billion. Our risk is growing in terms of exotic pests and diseases and trying to keep them out of the country and not impacting on not only our commercial production industries, but on our lifestyles, our ability to grow food at home, and also our natural environments. Every year at Australian ports of entry, we have over 30,000 pests intercepted at Australian ports of entry. So that's a high number, and it keeps our biosecurity staff very, very busy with their inspections. So the point I'd just like to make, and this relates directly to why we're collecting bud sticks this season, is biosecurity is really important for our overall domestic food security. So I think we all had a sense during COVID in particular how fragile our supply chains can be. If we end up with an exotic pest or disease that wipes out production of a particular commodity or makes it too expensive for producers to keep running their businesses, or means that movement restrictions are put in place so they can't shift their produce from one region to another, that impacts on our supply chain. And that means that it impacts on our food security. And it makes it harder for us to get the food that we want, and it makes it more expensive for us to get the food that we want as well. So our risks in terms of exotic pests and diseases coming into the country, they can come in different ways, but some of the major risks are wind, so blowing particularly insects across northern Australia. We've had that happen on multiple occasions. Island hopping, so we have a chain of islands down the Torres Strait leading to Cape York Peninsula. We can get particularly insects and sometimes diseases being brought down that island chain. And a big one for the citrus industry is entry of pests through ports of entry in passenger luggage and in cargo on ships and on planes. So early detection is what we're trying to do through Citrus Watch, and particularly through the Early Detector Network. So in terms of the biosecurity system in Australia, governments take a systems approach to make sure that at different steps in the pathway, pests can be detected and restricted from accessing Australia. So, for instance, in terms of pre-entry, government might set up an agreement with another country that we're trading with and say, look, before you send any of your product or commodity over to us, it might need to be fumigated, for instance. So there are laws and agreements in place. But sometimes we do get pests and diseases arriving that we don't want. And at that point, the idea or the key goal is when they arrive at a port of entry, it might be Melbourne Airport, for instance, or Port of Botany, that inspections catch them early. So we can catch them before they actually get onto the mainland. But there are escapes, as we know. We often hear in the media about these circumstances where we have to undertake a response when we find an exotic pest or disease on the mainland and we find out where it is, we need to do surveillance. And in some cases, we decide to try and eradicate. Sometimes eradication proves too expensive or really not possible if the pest is established and spread too far. If it has wings, that makes it very difficult. And that's when we get establishment of pests and diseases, and we need to learn to live with them. And so, in short, it's much more cost effective for us to invest in prevention at the early stage in terms of, for instance, early detection at the border, which is what we're trying to do with the Citrus Watch Early Detector Network, then response or management later down the track. And it's also better in general for our food security and for our natural environments too. Would anyone like to take a guess as to what these invasive pests are? You might have seen them in the media over the last couple of years. They have pretty high profiles. Anyone like to put that in the chat or call it out? Yep. Thanks, John. Brown marmorated stink bug. A, that's correct. So the picture in B, you'll see that there's a little insect sticking onto this bee here. Someone said varroa mite, correct, and fall armyworm. A plus, everyone. So brown marmorated stink bug is not present in Australia, but we do tend to get interceptions of this bug in shipping containers that have come from other places around the world. And the reason is weather established in places, for instance, in Europe or the US, when the weather gets colder in the Northern Hemisphere, these bugs like to find somewhere nice and warm to rest. And so they'll find a shipping container, for instance, which is nice and sheltered, send out an aggregation pheromone, and you end up with quite a few bugs in the one container. And then, of course, they're shipped to Australia and they wake up and they're in a beautiful, warm environment and they think that it's just the best thing ever. And so every year, our biosecurity staff at the borders are kept very busy doing inspections, trying to find these bugs. This bug in particular scares me quite a bit. There was a report from one homeowner in the USA, in New York, who decided to count all of the stink bugs that he found in his home in 1 year. And he stopped after 6 months because he'd counted 26,000 stink bugs and decided that was enough. He wasn't going to count anymore. And he was finding them in his bread containers. He was finding them under his doona, in his shoes. So it's a pest that can impact on our agricultural industries, but it's a huge lifestyle pest as well. Varroa mite, obviously.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Is it related, is the stink bug related to the shield, the stink bug that we have here in Australia?
They're all pentatomid bugs, so they're all types of shield bugs. We do have shield bugs that look similar in Australia, but the shield bugs we have in Australia, the vast majority won't impact on our crops, for instance. And they all, they're native, so they're settled into the ecological niche here. Certainly aren't as what we call polyphagous, don't eat as wide a variety of plants that brown marmorated stink bug will eat. I think it has a host range of about 300 different plant species, which is really wide. Yeah. And replicates very quickly and is very difficult to manage.
It does.
So for the sake of time, I won't go through fall armyworm and varroa mite. All I will say is varroa mite is under eradication in Australia, and we're very much hoping that we can still get rid of it, turn into a very large eradication in New South Wales. Fall armyworm is an example of one of those species that was probably brought here on wind from the north into northern Australia. It's almost overnight we found it, and when we started looking, we started finding it in other places, and it very quickly became apparent that we can't eradicate it, and we're learning how to manage it now. But that insect has caused a lot of problems in other countries around the world, particularly those countries that are very reliant on the maize industry. So these graphs just to show you that our risk from interceptions of pests and diseases are going up all the time. So on the left, I've just shown a graph of ant interceptions coming into Australia based on commodity group, and they're mostly coming in on live plants and cut flowers. And on the right, this is an interesting graph. I think it's It's forest arthropod pests that have established in Australia since 1885. So it's a great data set. And you can see that we have hundreds of pests of forestry in Australia that we didn't necessarily have a few hundred years ago. So it's concerning. So as I mentioned, we have quite a few people coming into Australia every year with biosecurity risk material. There was a report released a year and a half ago that estimated that over 3,800 travellers are coming into Australia with high-risk biosecurity material that is undetected. And that was for the first 9 months of 2019 and 2020. So it's quite a few. In 2017, 5.5% of all biosecurity interceptions for that year were citrus interceptions. So that's what we're particularly concerned about in the citrus industry. And we have, regular border interceptions of key exotic pests of citrus diseases, such as citrus psyllids and diseases such as citrus canker. So I've just shown a couple of screen grabs of some interceptions that we've had over the years of some key exotic threats of citrus. So I'll just mention that a couple of years ago, someone came into the country with some bud sticks. They smuggled them in the inner tube of a car tire. So they were, they knew it was the wrong thing. They were hiding them. And they were found at Brisbane Airport, thankfully. And when those bud sticks were tested, it was found that they were infected with Huanglongbing disease, which is the most impactful disease that you can ever find in a citrus industry. It's an industry killer. So that's a major risk for us, is people coming into the country deciding they want a particular variety of citrus, for instance, and smuggling in those bud sticks is a real problem. And then another risk is sometimes people will bring in some, curry leaf or kaffir lime for cooking, for instance, and they'll be infested with things like exotic citrus psyllids. So you can see the picture on the right here, which is the insect vector of Huanglongbing disease. So what are we testing for when we're testing bud sticks? We're testing for two key exotic disease threats. The first one is citrus variegated chlorosis, which is a disease caused by a bacterium called Xylella fastidiosa, and it's carried by this sharpshooter you can see on the top left here called Glassium sharpshooter. We don't have the vector in the country, but we're surveying for that. And the bottom right is citrus greening or Huanglongbing disease. It's known by both of those common names, and it's the bacterium that causes this disease is vectored by an insect called Asian citrus psyllid on the top left here, and another kind of psyllid that's less widely distributed. The impact of Huanglongbing disease, I can't understate it. I was in the US a few months ago having a look at how they're learning to manage this disease in Florida, and they're at the point where they have to grow their citrus trees for the first 3 years under these tree defenders. So can you imagine having 500 trees in a block and having to put these tree defenders over every single tree, pinning them down, and essentially babying these trees for the first 3 years of life? It's a huge cost in terms of labour, for one thing. And those tree defenders is to stop the psyllid from getting into and infecting the tree with the disease. When they take them off, within 30 days, they're infected. So that's, they have abundant psyllid populations there. They know they're going to get infected. They're just trying to give them the best start in life. They're so desperate to find essentially a management solution for this disease that they've started injecting their trees with antibiotics now. So it's a really serious situation. The disease essentially makes the tree super sensitive to any stresses in the environment, such as heat stress or drought stress. It causes nutrient deficiency and huge yield losses. I'm going to run a little bit over time, everyone, so I'll just speed things up a little bit. Just to put a little bit of context behind Huanglongbing disease, in 2021, Florida produced 57 odd million boxes of citrus. They used to be the major citrus producer in the USA. So before the disease was found, they were producing 174 million boxes of citrus, which is just a huge a huge change to their citrus industry. And it causes all sorts of symptoms: tree dieback, nutrient deficiency, as I said, you can see in the leaves, changes to the fruit quality and size as well. Xylella fastidiosa causes citrus variegated chlorosis. So the symptoms of this are lesions on the leaves, dieback of the plant eventually, and chlorotic spots on the leaves between these lesions here, and general ill health of the plant. So bud stick sampling. So these are the two diseases that we're trying to detect from an early detection standpoint, and this is where the bud stick sampling comes in. So bud sticks are these little green twiglets that you'll find on citrus that will grow. They're chopped usually in about 10 centimetre increments, as you can see on the top right here. And they're most commonly used, apart from detection of exotic pests like we're doing with this blitz, to create new citrus plants. So bud sticks or budwood will be chopped into segments, and these little buds that are emerging on the side of the bud stick will be cut off, as you can see on the far right photo, and then they'll be grafted onto a rootstock as and essentially a budwood will become a scion, the top of the plant, and the rootstock will become the bottom of the plant, and the rootstock will give the plant certain properties such as disease resistance. And that's how we grow a citrus tree, a really healthy citrus tree, is we graft these buds onto rootstocks. What does a bud stick look like? Well, what we're asking you to do is to cut 10 centimetres of a bud stick for these samples. You'll know that it's a bud stick when you have a look at the plant. You'll notice on a citrus tree, you get stems that look more brown and woody in colour, and then some that are newly emerging that are really green and have a different shape to them. When you cut a bud stick in cross-section, right across it, you will see that it's triangular in shape. So it's not rounded, it's got corners, and that's a bud stick. The stems themselves are green, not brown woody colour. They're fairly newly emerged, and the leaves are expanded, but they're not hard and leathery leaves, but they are fully expanded. They're not that feathery type of leaf that you'll see in a new flush of growth. So that's how you detect or find a bud stick. And I've just put a little beware of thorns note up here. If you're collecting them, you might want to wear gloves. So just be careful. Some citrus can get very thorny. So as you walk around a tree looking for bud sticks, you might see certain stems sticking out that can be easy to pick off. So I usually walk around the outside of the tree and look for those that are within easy reach. So you can see a stem on this photo sticking out at the top here. That would be perfectly fine to pick. And you can either, you can use secateurs to take your bud sticks from the same tree, or you can just break them off with your hand. I tend to just break them off. They're very easy to do. So where should you pick your bud sticks from on the tree? Well, I tend to think of the tree as if I'm looking down at the tree from a bird's eye view, and I separate the tree into quarters, and then I walk around the tree and I take a bud stick from each quarter of the tree. So on this tree on the bottom here, I've got area on the left, on the right, and the front and the back. So you think about your tree in quadrants. And it's very simple. After you've picked your bud sticks, all you need to do is put the bud sticks into the Ziploc bag supplied. What I suggest is if there are thorns on the bud stick, you might just want to take off the thorns. They're pretty easy to pick off, or you can use secateurs to cut them off. Otherwise, they'll pierce the bag. And we've supplied 2 Ziploc bags. So if you put it in the first Ziploc bag, seal that, fill out the label that we've put on the Ziploc bag with the date, address, and plant type, and then double bag it in the next Ziploc bag, and then you can pop the bud stick sample into this bamboo envelope that we've supplied. The next thing to do is to open your MyPest Guide Reporter app and submit a report under the Citrus Watch program. I've had a few people say to me it's hard to find the program when they get into the MyPest Guide Reporter. If you can't find the program from the drop-down list, all you need to do is press the green Show More button on the right, and then the list of programs will be expanded, and you'll be able to find the Citrus Watch program from that list. And then after that, it's very simple. In the tree type and in the comment field, if you just pop in your tree type, so for instance, lemon tree, and a site description like my backyard garden, you can pop that in and then you can just click upload on the report. And then after that, it's a simple case of placing the bud stick into the express post bag supplied that is already pre-labeled with the address, and then refrigerate the bud stick until mailing. And we ask people to please mail within 2 days. The reason being, when the bud sticks arrive at the Elizabeth MacArthur Agricultural Institute, where the citrus pathology team will be analysing these bud sticks, they're going to mash the bud sticks down to extract the DNA. And for the DNA to remain intact, it won't work if the bud stick has been in the heat for a few days, for instance. We need to make sure the DNA has good integrity. So the pathology lab at EMAI have been really strong supporters of the program for many years now, and they're in charge of doing that testing for those 2 exotic diseases that I mentioned. So I'm a little bit over time. I'm going to finish it there. But I've had a couple of questions come through, and I'll go through that now. One question: is there a way to properly clean our secateurs to prevent contamination of samples? Yes, there is. The easiest way that you can clean your secateurs, ideally you just be taking the bud sticks from one tree. And if you're doing that, you can use the same secateurs on that one tree. That's fine, because in reality, if we were to detect the exotic disease from your batch, we would be going and checking that entire tree anyway. If you're taking bud sticks from a couple of different trees, you can clean your secateurs by spraying them with alcohol between the tree. I use isopropyl alcohol between trees, but we prefer you to just take the samples from the one tree. I hope that answers your question.
Kirsty, sorry. I take it that we leave the leaves on the tree, on the bud sticks, don't we?
Yeah, you can leave the leaves on, as long as they fit into that little baggie. Yeah. I always leave the leaves on mine, just to give the lab a little bit more material to work with when they're extracting the DNA. Yep. Yeah. Are there any other questions or comments? Is it helpful to get additional bud stick samples from friends' trees in the area as well? The reason why we don't ask you to do that is because one thing I didn't highlight when I was explaining the sampling technique is we have barcodes on the sample bags, and it's really important for us in terms of basically a targeted biosecurity survey is what we're doing. We need to be able to track the sample back to that exact tree and the coordinates of that tree. So in an ideal world, I would love to get all the samples I could, but just to maintain the integrity of our data and tracking, we need to be able to say that barcode and the sample within that barcoded bag comes from that one tree. Mm-hmm. Do you have a preference between citrus varieties? I have a number of trees here. We don't have a strong preference because the diseases that we're looking for will impact all of citrus. What we do know is particularly Huanglongbing citrus greening is most impactful on grapefruit and sweet orange, but that doesn't directly relate to whether the bacterium is in a high level or tighter in other types of citrus varieties. So you could end up with a bacterium at a high level in, for instance, a lemon or mandarin, but the symptoms might not come out as strongly, but it's still there. So we don't have a strong preference, no. Are there any other questions? Do they have a preference between good sun, partly shaded, wetter, or drier? No, no preference. We'd rather get a good sample of bud sticks across lots of locations across the country. So we're doing this bud stick blitz across the country. So we'll end up with bud sticks coming from the Northern Territory and WA and Victoria, for instance. And so we'll end up getting lots of variation in how these citrus trees are grown anyway. But our key is we want lots of locations, which I think we've achieved with the volunteers that we have.
Great.
Great.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks all. I hope you found that information session interesting. I'm hoping to set up some interesting sessions on other topics such as citrus gall wasp and growing a healthy citrus tree. So if you have any feedback on what you'd like to learn about, let me know.
Citrus gall wasp, Kirsty, it's very bad in in Adelaide.
Yeah, and Melbourne too. And I've had feedback from a few people that'd like to learn about that. And so there's certainly someone I can tap into at New South Wales DPI who has been researching the gall wasp for a long time. So I'd love to set up a webinar with him. Would you like, one last question, would you like a variety of species? I know the locations of finger lime, calamondin, Trifoliate orange and Kaffir lime trees in my area. I think I would prefer you to just choose one tree. And I don't mind what citrus that you choose. So whatever tree that you can get good quality bud sticks from. How many samples are we hoping to test? So between the Budstick Blitz, we're hoping to get at least 100 samples from different locations, 100 different locations across the country. And combined with our targeted surveys that we do on the side where I and another Citrus Watch officer go out to different regions and take samples, we'll probably end up with about 150 samples this spring from locations across the country. Oh, thank you, Christy. Appreciate it. I think I'll keep that in mind because if this Budstick Blitz works well, what I think we will do is try and expand it next autumn to have a few more locations under our belt. We just need to keep in mind that we don't go a little bit too crazy or will overwhelm the diagnostic staff at the other end of the chain. So I have to keep that in mind as well. But yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Thanks, Christy. Okay, thanks everyone. I might wrap it up there because we have gone over time and apologies for that. But thank you so much for joining. It's great to have you all involved and yeah, just really appreciative of you giving up your time for this. So thanks all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.